Yes.
Hi, everybody. We've done some new things tonight, and they aren't quite working perfectly as they should, but practice makes perfect. Tonight, we've got a pretty good show for you. It's another hot topic, particularly with SGP changing its mode for billing people and some other things. The topic of what software to use has come up again. And there's a very popular piece of software out there called Astro Pixel Processor. And Brent Maynard has volunteered to come in and tell us about it. And he's going to show us a little bit about how it's used, what its powers are, what he gets out of it, and some cool things like that. So before we go into that, I am going to ask my dear colleague, Tolga, to come on in. And Tolga, if you could share your screen and show people what the options are for using our Facebook page.
Yeah. So TIC, the Astro Imaging Channel, has a Facebook page. I'm going to share my screen and show you guys. I'm trying. Still trying. Are you seeing it?
Yeah, we got it.
All right. So this is our Facebook group. We'll put this link over here on the chat or on the description down below, so you guys can find it. So this one you can become a member. You could just go to this group and be a member of it, and we have to approve it because believe it or not, there are a lot of scammers out there, so we have to look through them. So but we could tell who's an astrophotographer or not, so don't worry about that. We'll just approve you, and then you can post your images here, and for people will comment and like and say good job. Here's some of the pictures that people have posted recently. We also have a Facebook page. I'll show you that too. Right here. This is our page. This one, it's like a website. This one you cannot join. You could follow it, and if you follow it, you'll get Molly and I. We put our shows over here, and you'll get notifications. Or if we make an announcement, you will get a notification of what's going on with the Astro Imaging Channel. But mostly, for the most part, you would want to join the group. It's called the Astro Imaging Channel group. So I'm gonna stop sharing.
Okay, and I'll pick it up here. I'm going to be sharing my entire screen, and when I do that, I am going to go first over to the calendar because I want to preview some things that we've got coming up. Brent's tonight, of course, and then Andy Campbell. He does Andy's Astro, and he's a really cool photographer from down under. Terry Robus helped recruit him, I think, and he's going to be telling us about creating dynamic images next week. The week after that, we have two newcomers to the show. Jay and Neil Shutt will be talking to us about a couple of projects they have had. One is about phase stacked moon, and the other is a high-res Milky Way panorama. And they've done some really good pictures, and they've got a lot of enthusiasm. I think we could learn a lot from them. So they'll be here on October 11th. Barbara Harris is coming after that to tell us about observing variable stars. Amy Astro runs a very popular blog site where she puts out YouTube videos and stuff like that. She'll be here October 25th, and then Alistair Simon will be telling us about how he creates his magical wide field mosaics. You'll notice that after November 1st, we don't have anybody. And I don't like that. I like being at least 6 weeks ahead, maybe 7, 8, 10 weeks ahead if I can get it. It can be difficult to recruit people. We do appreciate that we've gotten 2 or 3 volunteers lately. We've gotten 2 or 3 people made suggestions to us. And the way you can go ahead and do that is to hit our contact place right here and contact us and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I'd like to do a show about such and such. And yeah, we screen you. We don't let just anybody come in here, but we'll let most anybody come in here. So please do what you can and sign up. And we need presenters. And I think that you can see that we're just a group of people. We're just a group of people that like astro imaging. Fill out this little form, send it to us, and we'll schedule you up, and we'll go, tell you how to do things and stuff like that. One of the things that continue to disappoint me through my life here is past shows. Okay, there's a couple of ways to get past shows in here. One is to hit this, but you know what? None of us actually keep this up to date, and it doesn't have all the shows that we've got. If you go to the home page, and then down here you click on the Astro Imaging channel, the YouTube portion, you can find our YouTube stuff. But even then, they only show maybe 20 or 30 right there. However, if you hit videos, you can see eventually all, what's it been, 6.5 years, 300 and some videos that we've taken here. I'd strongly suggest you do that. However, I got to tell you, we haven't done a good job providing this to you. Somebody wrote me today and said that, hey, have so-and-so who gave a presentation 3 years ago come back and do another presentation, because he said he wanted to do another presentation. I said, okay. And I went looking for so-and-so from 3 years ago. It took me 10 minutes to find his program. And I kind of know what's on the Astro Imaging channel. You know what I mean? So I can imagine that some guy is just out there, some person's getting into it. They don't even know what questions to ask. Molly's done some work to try to organize this, but we really could use some help out there. If somebody knows enough how to get a database together with all the facts about the programs that we've had, in order to make this a useful resource, we need some help with that. So once again, you can head back over to the Astro Imaging channel, the contact, and say, Alex, I'm getting really bored with this COVID thing, and I wouldn't mind, making comments and help contribute to a spreadsheet or something that kind of keeps track of all the programs that we've ever had. If you'd like to do that, just tell us about it, because we could use that. Okay. One other thing I always like to point out to you, let me see, where are we going here? Here, it's our show for tonight. Over here, you should be making your comments, saying hey to everybody, because it's your club, saying hi to everybody, how you doing? You'll notice you can make a donation. Most importantly, if you are not yet subscribed, and if you like the show, go ahead and subscribe. You'd be one of, what is it, 9.56 or 9.55 thousand, there it is, 9.55 thousand subscribers that we've had so far. So please get to be part of it, volunteer. It's a club. It needs your participation. Okay, enough of that. I've got to stop sharing my screen. How do I do that? I think I hit that. Oops, that's not going to work. I'm in the wrong place. There. And stop presenting. Anyway, it is now time for our guest speaker, Brent Maynard, to take over. Brent's going to tell us about AstroPixel Processor. So take over, Brent.
Good evening, and thanks again for having me on the Astro Imaging channel. I'm coming to you tonight from a beautiful part of West Virginia, the Blackwater Falls State Park. So I'm going to show one picture of the fall colors here. It's almost peak season right now. But my name is Brent Maynard. I work at Marshall University. I'm an IT director on the administrative side. And one of my lifelong hobbies has been stargazing, and that ultimately led into doing imaging, starting way back with webcams and film cameras, and just been progressing ever since. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation. And I'm assuming everything's flowing through okay.
Yep, looks good.
So there's my contact information. Feel free to email me at any point in time if you have any questions about anything we discussed this evening. This was a shot I took this afternoon of the Blackwater River in Blackwater Falls State Park. And as you can see, the colors are just now starting to turn into the glorious autumn colors we have in the mountains here in West Virginia. But what we're going to talk about tonight is how do I image what's my workflow? How do I process my images from capture all the way to post-processing? And some of the basic information, capture as many raw images as possible. Try to balance the exposure ISO and the limits of my mount as far as how long I can get a good exposure without overdriving the ISO and introducing too much noise. And with the goal of trying to get a good histogram, and we'll go over that here in just a minute of what I'm talking about to get a good histogram. Once I capture my raw images, my typical workflow, and sometimes I'll process the raw images directly in the tool, but most times, I'd say 80% of the time, I go ahead and pull my raw files into Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. I'm just now starting to use Lightroom. I've typically used Adobe Camera Raw, but the tool sets are basically the same as far as the pre-processing options that you have between those two tools from Adobe. Some of the basic things that I do is lens correction, color balance, some of the just minimal changes. I don't do a lot of tweaking in the pre-processing because I don't want to introduce anything too soon before we start doing the integration process in AstroPixel Processor. And once I've done all that, I then save those images out from the raw format to 16-bit TIFFs. And then I use AstroPixel Processor to do the calibration, normalization, the stacking and stretching, and sometimes I'll stretch the images in AstroPixel Processor, and sometimes I won't, and then I'll do some of the more traditional stretching that I've done in Photoshop, and kind of compare the two and see which one can produce the best results. And it's interesting, different night, different targets, different sets of data, one does better than the other sometimes. It's just kind of interesting, and I'm still, it's a learning process, and I'm still getting familiar with the tool. I've been using it for almost 9 months now, I would say. I started last December. I was always a deep sky stacker kind of guy. So this is a step up for me from a open source freeware type of solution to a product like AstroPixel Processor. Also, I want to state I have no affiliation with AstroPixel Processor. I was looking at it and looking at PixInsight, and from what I could tell, it has a little bit easier learning curve. PixInsight is a huge ocean of tools and data sets and all kinds of different things you can do, from my understanding, and it's got a fairly significant learning curve. AstroPixel Processor is also got a pretty good learning curve, but it doesn't seem to be as extensive or as intimidating as PixInsight. And hopefully tonight pique some interest for folks about maybe want to test it out. You can do a 30-day free trial, which is what I did to kind of kick the tires and see how it worked. And after that, I opted in for the annual rental agreement versus the purchase. And then eventually, at this point, I'd probably, when my annual subscription runs out, I might just go ahead and purchase it. And we'll see. I'm still, kind of playing around with it. But it's a great tool that so far that I've been using it. I use Photoshop for post-processing, doing any additional stretching, color correction, and I use Noel Carboni Photoshop actions to do some deep sky noise reduction and some space noise reduction, some of the action sets that he has for Photoshop. I'm going to show a couple sets of images, results that I've used recently, where I've done this workflow with APP. I'll just say APP from now on, just to make it a little bit easier instead of saying AstroPixel Processor. But the camera that I've been using is a modified Canon RP full frame sensor. I modified it myself. It's actually not too intimidating if you are inclined to dig into some electronics like that. It's actually the easiest Canon that I've ever modified to remove the one filter that blocks our hydrogen alpha signal. And the lens that I've been using recently is a Sigma 85mm Art Series 1.4 lens. It's a great little lens. Typically shoot at ISO 2000 to 2500 for these two images at f2. So let's just jump real quick to show the images, and we'll talk about these a little bit more in detail, especially if anybody has any questions when we get there. So this is a 2-panel mosaic that I processed in APP. This was from Spruce Knob, West Virginia. It's about 4,000 feet, 4,500 feet in elevation. It was a nice clear night. We were actually up there with the goal of imaging neowise, and so that was the whole reason to go to Spruce Knob. But it was a beautiful night, so we went ahead and continued imaging. And I did a 2-panel mosaic of the Rho Ophiuchus region into the central part of the Milky Way. And these are about an hour and a half per panel of total images with the Canon and that 85mm Sigma. And this was processed inside of APP. The other one is the IC 1396 elephant trunk region. What I'm trying to get to, and it's apparently is really a tough target to get, is the Squid Nebula inside of the Flying Bat. And it apparently is just a really big challenge to get that. But you can see this came out of APP. I haven't cropped it or anything. And so you can see that this was over 2 nights, 2 separate nights about a month apart. So you can see how the images are kind of stacking up inside of APP through the processing. This is about almost 8 hours worth of data, and it's still hard to get that Squid Nebula out. So let's bounce back to the presentation here. For the Milky Way Rho image, those were 3-minute subs at ISO 2000, about an hour and a half for each panel. And then for the IC 1396 SH2-129 Flying Bat area, those were 5-minute guided. And I was using an SCT duo-band filter. I've got the full frame on sale, but it just happens that the APS-C size filter will fit in there. It kind of causes some significant vignetting on the edges, but it still actually works. So I've been able to do some narrow band imaging in my neighborhood where I live. I live in about Bortle 5 sky, so it's fairly significant light pollution and sky globe. But up at Spruce Knob, no filter at all is required. Very, very dark. It's the darkest, it's probably the darkest location in the east, in the central East Coast. There's just no light domes there. So I mentioned before that I do a little bit of pre-processing, and what I will do here real quick is just take a minute to show. So here's a unprocessed sub. So this is the sub coming straight out of the camera as a raw file. You can see the vignetting to the left and right, and that's because of the filter. The SCT duo band APS-C size filter is actually square. So it actually fits the full frame sensor from top to bottom, but not left to right. It just needs to be a little bit wider. But I was really just targeting the stuff right there in the middle, so I just cropped the edges out for the vignetting until I get my full frame filter in. But up in the upper right-hand corner, we can see here that we have the histogram. And for a single exposure, this is what I'm trying to get to. I want the histogram to be about 50% of the way across. I don't want it too far to the left because I'm not getting enough signal, and I don't want it too far to the right because I'm overexposing. So I try to get somewhere right around 50%. So that's what I meant about trying to adjust the ISO, the exposure length, and how long I can actually guide, or how well my mount works to determine what my total exposure length can be, to get that histogram right there in the middle. And as I mentioned, inside of Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, I just do some of the basic minimal adjustments, lens correction, do some color noise adjustments, some chromatic aberration, just a few things, not too aggressive at all, just minimal. So now we'll go ahead and start jumping into AstroPixel Processor, APP. So this is just the main screen, and we're going to jump in. I know you can't see this on the presentation, but this is what it looks like. It runs inside of Java. So it's a Java container that can run either on a MacBook or on a Windows PC. That was the other nice thing I liked about APP, is that it works on a MacBook, and that's what I use. Deep Sky Stacker is Windows only. So that was one thing I was looking for, is to getting away from Deep Sky Stacker, is because my primary laptop is a MacBook. Even though I can run virtual software and Parallels or VMware or VirtualBox, I'd rather have the full power of the machine behind it rather than introducing another abstraction layer of a virtual machine. So let's go to the next slide here. And what I'm going to jump into to show you the actual, some of these settings in APP that are important when you first get started. And so let me go ahead and jump in there. So this is a AstroPixel processor, the main screen. And I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. And the couple things you need to look at in the beginning when you first get started. You can see there's this little slider here that shows how many threads that you're allowing APP to use, how many processors. So my machine's an 8-core, so I have it set to 7, just so that my machine can still do work as well once I get a large job starting. But the other one that's very important is this memory setting. How much memory am I going to give to APP? And the first time I ran this, I didn't make this memory adjustment. It defaults to 2 gigabytes of memory, and that is not enough, especially if you have a large data set that you're processing. So one of the first things you want to do is just click on this little CFG button, which is the config button, and come down and pick how much RAM, how much memory you actually want to give APP to use. And for right now, for me, at least for my data sets, 8 gigabytes seems to work. My laptop has 16 gigabytes, so I thought, well, let's try half and see how that does. And so that's one of the first things you need to take into consideration, especially if you're doing the 30-day free trial. Make sure you make your memory adjustment up front. Give it about half whatever memory you have available, and that way you'll have plenty to do your work with. The other thing that we'll be talking about are what each one of these tabs are, and I will go through these and explain what's going on here. The nice thing about the most current version of APP is there are some automated settings now. And if you let it do the automated settings, it does a best guess based upon your data, the number of frames that you're providing and it will do a best guess of the best processing steps, options to use, and then you can just kind of press go and let it do its thing. And then you can go back later and tweak those settings and see if you can get a little bit better information. So I found that to be a nice feature in the later version. The newest version here is that it has an automatic settings option to help with the learning curve. So what I thought I would do, well, let's go ahead and do this now, is go back into APP, and let's just go ahead and go through some of these tabs. So let's just start with, if you're actually going to use raw files straight into APP, then you can make some of your changes either to the raw or FITS files, depending on what you want to do. What's the Bayer pattern? If it's a DSLR, it figures it out automatically based upon the camera type, or whatever camera that you have, you can choose whatever Bayer pattern that you need to for the raw image processing. The other thing that it has, which is kind of neat, this is also relatively new, is if you're doing narrowband imaging, then you can go through here and tell what type of optimization that you want to use that APP has provided for the different narrowbands that you might be interested in. The one that I've been playing with a little bit is this hydrogen alpha oxygen 3 collar that's kind of tuned for these dual narrowband filters that have the signal down at the oxygen O3 line in the blue-green area, and then the hydrogen alpha line. And so it can optimize your images based upon that as well. And then you can do things like extract the hydrogen alpha or extract the O3 as a separate data set to give you a lot more options if you want to. So I've done this a few times and had some decent results. But like I said in the beginning, most of the time I run my stuff through a preprocessor and deal with TIFF images. And so typically what I do is I come into where I actually do my, load my data. And so you can load your light frames, your flats, darks, dark flats, bias frames. If you have a master catalog already set up, then you can load your master calibration images in. And so this is basically what you do. So to just quickly, I can say, let's load some light frames. I'm just going to pick these 6 and do an open. And so it goes ahead and loads these in to AstroPixel Processor. And the next step would be if you take calibration frames, if you take darks, if you take flats, if you take bias frames, then you would go ahead and load, after you loaded those in, you would go ahead and run the calibration. And this is where it calibrates all of your individual subs with your master calibration frames. I haven't done any calibration frames for quite a while. With the newer cameras, they're such low noise that I really don't have to worry about doing darks anymore or bias frames. Sometimes I'll do flats depending on my optics, especially when I'm shooting through a C8 where I've got some significant vignetting going on or some stuff in my in the way, and some different things. I'll shoot some flats and I'll incorporate flats, but as far as the other ones, I typically don't. I just take the raw data, pre-process it, and then let the tool go from there. But this is where you would go ahead and apply any of your calibration frames inside of APP. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is I bounced back to the raw fits tab. And if I need to know something about something, I can just hover over the box, and you can see a little pop-up comes up, and it gives me good detail about what each option is. So for example, if I go over this algorithm, it gives me a pop-up explaining what all of those different options are. And I know you can't read this, but just basically as a general rule, any place inside of APP, you can hover over something and it will pop up a little help screen that basically describes what the options are here and what the benefits are of each one. So the next thing you do, and these are numeric, so I went from 0, 1, 2, now on the tab 3 is analyze stars. And for this one, I just take the defaults. I can specify the number of star detection that I want to do, but I just let it figure it out. And as you can see, as you pop over there, it'll, if you hover over, it'll pop up the little dialog there to help you make a choice. So you do the analyze stars, and then once that process finishes, you go into the registration. You can set your reference frame. If you have one good image that you know is the best, you can set it as your reference, or it will pick the reference frame if you do not specify one. The pattern recognition, and this is just some of the algorithms. And like I said, you know, I'm not an expert by this by any means. I'm a relatively new user. I've got good results out of it, straight from the, working at it from the beginning. So it's not too steep of a learning curve. So some of these things, I don't know what the underlying algorithm's actually doing, but it tells you in here, for example, the default is quadrilaterals, which means that if it matches between 250 and 5,000 stars between two separate frames, then quadrilaterals is the best to use. Pentagons would be 5,000 stars or more. Triangles down lower. So this is typically just choose quadrilaterals. I've not tried the other two. This is just, basically for when it gets ready to stack the images, it knows how to line everything up. The same thing on these, the scale start. If you're doing just normal registration, I'm one target, one night, no panels. I'm not trying to do a mosaic, then just leave that at 1. But if you're doing a mosaic, it says set this to at least 10. And then that way it gets enough overlap. It's looking for overlap between the frames so it can stitch those two frames together because you're doing a mosaic image. Some of these other options I've not played with yet. I'll just go ahead and say that right now. This dynamic distortion correction. If you have some optical distortion, then it can try to fix that. If you are, it can actually integrate images from different frame or different hardware. So you can have a different camera, different optics, and you can. On one night I used a APS size sensor with a 105 millimeter lens, and another night I used the full frame sensor with a 85 millimeter lens, and I want to try to stack those together. It can handle the scaling of that and pull those images together into a final image. The registration mode, I just always pick normal, and or if I'm doing mosaic, then I'll pick mosaic. If I like that first Milky Way row image, I would have chosen mosaic on that one. And the projection model, This is another one of the areas I have not gone into yet. I just let it take I just take the defaults on this. It's not as big of an ocean as I mentioned earlier as PixInsight, but it's still a pretty good size body of water of knowledge that over time that I'm hoping to get more and more comfortable with some of these settings. But for the basic stuff, I just kind of take the defaults and keep moving along, and it works out well. The normalization, if you've got your images are all basically the same target, same field of view, same basic exposure, then you can just leave that at regular. They recommend multiply scale. It's another one of those where it's just kind of the default. And I've not really gone into the tried some of these differences, but it when it comes up and it says here at the very second, on the second line, it says for almost all data sets the preferred method is multiply scale, and that's what I chose, or that's what I choose. And I haven't really gone into digging into any deeper detail on what some of these other ones will do. Neutralize background. This one you got to be a little bit careful with. It tries to make sure the background is even after it goes through its integration. But if you do that, then it can suppress your nebulosity. So if you've got some faint nebulosity in your images that you want to retain, you might want to turn off this neutralize background so it doesn't wash it out or kind of get rid of it. So I typically turn off neutralize background. You can also save out. On each one of these steps, you can save out your frames. So I can, as it goes through a step, I can save out my calibrated frames. Then I can save out my normalized frames, and then I can save out each data set if you want to. If you have enough storage, then that that might be something you might be interested in. But these images get quite large. So that's another thing you want to make sure you have plenty of is hard drive space. Anytime you're doing any of this processing, especially if you're dealing with 100 or 200 images, raw files or TIFF images, you're dealing with several tens of gigabytes of data to do this on any given image, final image. So before we get too much farther, I think we can take a second, see if there's any questions.
Oh, hi, Brent. There are a couple of comments, and I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Apparently, you're not the only one using AstroPixel Processor. There are a few people that are online on YouTube and are sharing your experience. So I'm sure they appreciate what you're saying. I have a couple of questions. Can you analyze your subs to determine the best reference, or just analyze them to determine the star quality before you start processing? Yeah,
it gives some information down here in the lower part of the screen, and so some of the data that it will do once you start doing the initial star counts, and it'll give you the signal noise ratios and some of those. And I think it uses all of those, which one it will do by default. What I've typically done in my pre-processing, if I see a really good subframe that as I'm pre-processing them, then I'll remember which one that one is, and I'll just manually set that as my reference frame. But in general, I just let APP pick the reference frame for me. So do you blink through your subs before you get started? Yes, in either Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. But you can also do it here. So I can actually load each one of these images. So that is a image that has been pre-processed in Adobe Camera Raw. It's not been stretched or anything. This is just the base data coming from the camera after it's been converted to a TIFF file. So I can bounce through each one of these, and I can zoom in and kind of pixel peek to see, see what a good image might be, and pick which one I want to be the reference frame. But for the most part, most of my images are all basically the same, except for maybe some stars that aren't good. I will get rid of those anyway.
Now, as part of your pre-processing, it seemed to want to remove gradients, but I assume you're doing that in part with flats. But what about a light dome that might be in the area, or just bad seeing conditions at night? Is that something you do in APP, or is that wait till you get into Photoshop?
Photoshop, but there are, when I get to the tools menu, which is number 9, there are some options in there to get rid of light pollution and equalize your background, and those work pretty well, especially if you have some, in my area where I normally image, I just have light pollution. So my whole frame is just, if I take too long of an exposure, it's just milky. It gets overexposed pretty quick. But typically I'll take care of that in Photoshop at the end, using some of Noel Carboni Photoshop actions help with that as well.
Tim made the comment that APP performs in similar to PixInsight. Have you had any experience in to compare the two?
I do not. I've not used PixInsight before. I think I was probably a little intimidated just from hearing other people talk about PixInsight and the learning curve, and that's what kind of maybe steered me towards APP. I know PixInsight runs on both MacBook and Windows, but APP was 2 reasons. That it's a little cheaper to step your toe into the water to play with it than PixInsight. I know PixInsight is a much more robust, comprehensive tool set, and someday I might get there. But so far, I've been happy with APP. PixInsight's in my future, I think. I just haven't got there yet.
Those are all the questions I have. Alex, anybody else?
Let me see, am I a microphone on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. You're saving in TIFFs and not in JPEGs. And do you ever have a problem when you're finished with your work? Do you save in JPEGs?
I save everything in TIFFs, and then I will create a JPEG to publish out on Facebook or to a website or something.
Now, do your JPEGs, when you've saved them, do they look about the same? I mean, they probably don't have quite the dynamic range because they don't have 16 bits. They're running on only 8 bits. But do you have any problems matching your JPEGs? I mean, they look kind of like your TIFFs.
So here's a JPEG. They do. As long as you don't try to stretch them anymore, or you don't try to do anything crazy with them, then you can have a pretty decent representation of what you can see. So this is a JPEG. This is a JPEG. This is a TIFF that's been stretched. This JPEG is a representation of a single frame. This is a single frame from the row Ophiuchus. And this is a single image from the galactic center. You can see the prancing pony, but these are JPEGs. As long as I don't try to do anything to them, that's fine. If I try to stretch them, you lose it quick.
Because you've run out a lot of the data.
Yes.
Instead of having 16 bits worth of data, you've only got 8 bits worth of data, so you don't have the dynamic range.
Yeah.
But the question is, well, as I understand it, JPEGs are for transmitting, publishing, et cetera, your work, and not for saving them if you're going to continue to work on them.
That is correct. Never, always save it out as a 16, at least for me, I always save it out as 16-bit TIFFs.
Now, when you're working with APP and you've saved something as a JPEG so it can later be published, you don't have any problems with that. It saves it pretty faithfully.
Yeah, Photoshop. Out of APP, I always save as 16-bit TIFFs.
Okay, so
Everything.
the only place you ever save your final data is out of Photoshop after you've worked at it some more.
That's correct.
Okay, maybe Tim, that's your issue. I don't see how. I mean, you should be able to save something in Astro and APP and Photoshop and PixInsight and anything. Save it in a JPEG format, and it'll look pretty much the same when you download it. Where it might not is if you've got some kind of misconfiguration in your monitor, that your monitor's not adjusted correctly, you're using a slightly different color space or something like that. And those are the things you should be able to figure out. Those are the things you're going to have to look into. It's more than just which file format you've saved it in. When you still want to work on the image, you definitely want to save it in TIFF or XISF or Adobe Photoshop's formula. They've got their own format, something like that. But then when you finally want to send it out to your friends, you can save it in PNG or JPEG or something like that. And it should look pretty much the same. Okay.
I think the only caveat to that, if you ever want to have it printed in a nice high resolution format
Yeah.
by a professional printer, you want to send them a TIFF, not a JPEG.
So in APP, these are the options that you can save it as. You can save it as a FITS, a TIFF, or a JPEG.
Yeah.
So you can save it as a JPEG. But
Okay.
I usually do TIFF, and then it's going to ask me the color space. So these are the 3 color spaces that it supports. And then it's going to ask me 8 or 16 bits.
Want to move into a different area here. Linda is asking us about if you've done 2 nights worth of imaging and you put all your images together and you've come up with something, and then you go back the next weekend and get 2 more nights worth of imaging. Do you have to start from scratch, or what is your suggested route of doing that?
What I do is I will reprocess the whole set again.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly, I think, and this is just my understanding, is that I can help enhance the signal and minimize the noise if I add more and more data to it, rather than taking a pre-stacked image that's been processed and then trying to add to that again. I think you get better results if you take the whole data set again and run it through and let it do that whole process of building up the signal and flattening out the noise on each frame.
Well, I guess Alex's question might have been, once you have a setup and you've had 20 or 30 subs, can you save that particular configuration and then go back and reload it and then add another 10 or 20 later on? Or do you have to go from the beginning and run the whole thing?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I know you can do that with Deep Sky Stacker. You can save out all the settings so you can come back later and add new images, and it will only register and calibrate the new images, and because it knows what it already did with the previous set. That's something I have to look into. Like I said, I typically just throw them all back in there and just let it do it all again. But that would be interesting if I can. I can check on that and try to give you guys an update.
You know, I don't think you have to redo everything. If you go through a calibration of the other set, and then at the end you stack up all of those calibrated registered frames, you should get fundamentally the same result as if you did the whole set. And it should take less time if you do that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Eric, do you know that you can do that from APP?
I don't know if you can. I know you do it in PI. I don't know whether you.
Yeah, right. I know, and everything else well, if you can have different stages, the first stage is to calibrate your data, and I don't know if you can calibrate one set of data and then another set of data, and then some other evening bring 2 sets of calibrated data together into one set.
Well, I think you probably just helped me answer the question. So if I go to, like I mentioned earlier, if I go to any of these tabs, like the register tab, I can save out the registered frames. After I do integration, I can save out the integrated frames.
Okay.
And so I believe I can do that. And then you can pull those images back in because they've already been through it all, and then you just have to do it again. That way you don't have to go through all the steps again. So that, I think that answers the question.
So whichever night you took the frames, you calibrate them according to those flats, those darks, those everything else, so that they're all pretty well matched together within that particular evening. And then you can register them, you can do whatever you want. But when it finally comes down to do the last stacking, you want all of them registered to the same master, and then you want the statistics applied to the whole set of all the frames that you've got in any particular filter or binning, etc.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best.
Okay.
I think, Brent, you're getting some help here over from YouTube. Let me read a couple of comments.
Okay.
Trevor K says, on the load tab, there is the ability to do multi-processing. Ask Brent to show people. And Tim says you can take it through to normalization and save the normalization frames, then bring multiple sets of normalized frames together for integration.
Yes. So I do the multi-session processing. So you can see here on the load tab, you can tell if you're doing multi-channel or if you're doing multi-session. And when you do when you load your light frames, then you can tell it, you can give it information about what session that is, so it can keep track of that. So APP can keep track of that.
And we have a question, and I can't find it now, but it was basically, what do you use to gather your data? What's your what telescope mount, etc.? I think was the question. I've lost the question.
So it's the camera is a Canon RP that's been modified. For these images that you're seeing this evening, it's a Sigma 85 millimeter lens, ProArt 1.4, but shot at 2.0 f-stop. And then my mount is an Orion Sirius mount. And then I use ASI Air for guiding and helping control the mount. It's just a ASI 224 camera for guiding when I guide.
That was John who was asking that question. He also asked about filter wheel, but it looks like you're using one-shot color.
Yes.
There's one more comment from Beatrice Heinz. I use both APP and PI. PI has a much more steep learning curve. We can all testify to that. For post-processing, she uses Affinity Photo as an alternative for Photoshop. That's not relative to what you're talking about, but that was a comment. So I think you can get back to your presentation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why don't you go to that? Yeah.
So after we normalize the frames, you come into the integration. This is where it really takes the effort. This is where the CPU gets really stressed out, throwing all this data at it to do the final integration. I mentioned early on that there is this automatic mode. This is new. And I've been using the automatic mode, and it seems to do a pretty good job. If I pick one of the other ones where I either do an average, a median, or a maximum, then I get some, these options down below become ungrayed. They're not grayed out anymore. So if I hover over this again, it gives you the tooltip, and which is better, median, average, or maximum. And so this is APP's recommendations. If you use less than 20 frames, use median. If you're using more than 20, use average. If you want to create star trails, use maximum. The automatic will choose for you. But if you, let me get over here and zoom in a little bit better. If I pick on average, then I've got a bunch of things that I can now choose. So which one of these is best? So another pop-up will come up, and you can read through those, and it explains what each one is, what the benefits or the detriments of each setting would be. And so you can pick this. I'm just going to arbitrarily pick noise. Outlier rejection. So if we want to get rid of the Starlink satellites, we want to make sure that we're rejecting those satellites right out of the image, so we don't have to worry about streaks in our final image. Hot pixels, airplanes. You'd be surprised. If I have 30 or 40 frames, and let's say 3 or 4 of them have some nice high-flying jets going through them, or Starlink satellites, or the ISS flies by, I just let it stay. I don't throw those frames away, because with this outlier rejection, it'll take care of that. Some of these images, if I opened up one of these individual TIFFs, I don't want to take time to look for it, but almost every frame that I ever shoot has something in it. It's got either a plane, a satellite, or something in there that's causing issues. And I just make sure that you enable the rejection. The one that seems to be most popular is this Windsorized algorithm. You set the kappa. I usually just start about 1.5 or so, and what the high value is. And you can kind of play around with these depending on your camera, your sensor, how much noise it might have, how many hot pixels it might have, or whatever might be going on in your frame. You might have to increase these kappa values a little bit more to get those out of the way. But for me, with my optics and my camera sensor that I'm using right now, these values 1.5 or so seem to work well. Diffraction protection, that's if if you want to get rid of spikes, or if you have if you're using a refractor or reflector with a central obstruction, you've got the arms coming across to hold the secondary. You can, if you want to keep those, make sure that you can make a setting to keep those diffractions if you want to. The composition mode, I always just keep that at full. Local normalization correction is, if you read what it tells you, that if you're typically using the same object and all your frames are evenly illuminated and everything looks good, then you don't need any local normalization correction. But you can, if you've got some different nights or different cameras or different optics or whatever that you're throwing at your data set, then you might want to play with this. This will increase your processing significantly, depending on how many iterations that you go through. But I typically have been keeping this off, and it seems to be doing a pretty good job. This is where I think this is multi-band blending. Now this is if you're creating mosaics and you want to do a good job of stitching the images together. So you can't see where the line is between the two sets of data. So if I take 30 frames of one panel and 30 frames of the other panel, and I know I've got some overlap in there, when it finally stitches this together, I have forgotten to enable this MBB, the multi-band blending, and you can see the line. But with this, when I click this checkbox, I can't see the where the frames come together. So if I go back to this particular image, this is 2 frames, and somewhere in the middle here, where they overlap, you really can't see. It does a good job of blending those 2 sets of data together to create a final mosaic. And then when you get, there's some other, if you want to drizzle your image, you want to increase the size, you want to create some these outlier rejection maps, normalization maps, and I have not done any of these yet to even look at to see what those do. If you want to do drizzling to make just scale the image, you can do that as well on the integration. This is the one that takes a good bit of time. But as I mentioned before, I've been lately been choosing automatic and letting APP make the decisions, and it seems to be doing a pretty good job for most of these settings. But you can still come down here and do some of these other settings like the local normalization correction, drizzling, and things like that. And then once you get to that point, I can bring in, let's pull in one of these integrations. Which one? So this is a final stacked image from, this is 7 hours worth of data almost, 81 frames of data for the IC1396 and Flying Bat. Once it integrates and you load up this final integrated image, then we're over onto the right side of the screen. This is where the stretching and the processing comes into play. I can go ahead and have it do some stretching. So by default, at least on mine, it always comes up with this 15% background, 3% sigma, 2.5% base. And I was reading an article about, what does each one of those values mean? And you can hover over the question mark or click on the question mark, and it'll bring up a little tutorial, and it will explain to you everything that's going on in this right pane, at least for this stretching, and what the benefits are of each different setting, and what each little slider can do as part of this process. What I typically do is I will come through here and just pick some of these presets. So I can do a no stretch, it gives me back, this is non-stretch data. And then I can just kind of start picking some of these presets and see how they look. And if I like one better than the other, then I can, okay, that looks pretty good. And then you can start going into some of these other areas and tweaking the data. So this is the black point. And so I can modify the background, darken the background up by this slider. This is the white point. Then we get into the gamma. That's the third one down. Let me zoom in a little bit. This is, I can disable this DDP, which is basically turns off the stretching that we just done. Then we have let's see, which one was this? I can't remember off the top of my head what the ST and the BA stand for. But then we have the highlights, the saturation, the luminance. We can do some sharpness, sharpening on this, contrast adjustments. But like I said, my typical workflow is I will let it do some level of automatic stretching by picking these presets. And I will save out this image, for example, as a TIFF image. But then I will go back and I will say, I don't want to stretch anything. I just want the stack. Just give me the stack, the raw stack of data. And then I will save this out as a TIFF image. So I'll save a kind of a processed, APP process stack and a non-process stack as a separate image. And then I'll bring those both into Photoshop and do some tweaking in Photoshop. I will go through and play with some of these sliders, like on the black point. So if I I don't want to do some processing. We're kind of running out of time. You kind of, it's like a rubber band slider. You just kind of flip it over and go through it and let it iterate a little bit. And just like things in Photoshop, you just do little tweaks at a time. You don't try to be overly aggressive on some of these sliders. But then the one other area that I need to cover before we are out of time here is on this is after the integration. We can stretch, we can do some black point, white point, saturation, contrast, a little bit of sharpening. Those are all available here on the right side of the APP tool. Last one is on the tools. These are some other tools we can apply to the final image. And I'm just going to pick one real quick. So let's just do the light pollution tool. And it says, do you want to use the current image? And I said, yes. So what it wants you to do is basically just draw boxes throughout the frame to try to pick out the gradient or areas for light pollution. And every image is a little bit different about how you might want to process this. This is definitely trial and error until you start understanding your sky conditions, your optics and things like that. But I just pick a bunch of areas of the image and then do a calculate. And it's going to go through and do some type of light pollution reduction algorithm. And you can see what it did based upon that. And if I'm happy with that, then I can go ahead and say, okay, and save. And then it gives me back that same dialog again to where I can save this out as an image. TIFF. So I'll just take that profile and get saving it out. Other ones in here, calibrate the background, calibrate star colors. So you can regain some star colors from your images. If you have an area that you're definitely getting some blue or orangish kind of stars, you can try to pull those back out again. If you have multi-channel you want to pull back together, you can use the combine RGB. Correct vignetting. The ones I typically play with that seem to do a pretty good job are the remove light pollution, especially where I live. Calibrate the background to try to get a nice even background across the image. This is where you can start getting rid of some of those gradients. I've been able to get rid of gradients by using this. And those are the two I mainly use, are the remove light pollution and the calibrate image. And then from here, I save them out as TIFFs and then pull them into Photoshop for the final processing. So let me go back to the slideshow. I think that's, yeah, we really don't have time to do a demo at this point. I was going, if we had time, we could do a little six image demo, but we could save that for another day.
Brent, I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Let's see. Does APP allow scripting?
There are these batch processes. I don't know the answer to that. I've not tried to do any scripting. This is a little bit different, maybe because it's a Java app. So I'm not sure if they've got that capability or not. That's another one I could kind of do a little bit of research on.
And I see it looks like you did background neutralization or whatever they call it.
Yeah,
and,
light pollution.
And color calibration on nonlinear images versus the linear images.
Oh yeah, there's these different, and that just defaults to linear, and you've got the calibrated, the registered, the normalized images that.
So do you do your color calibration and background neutralization on the linear or the nonlinear?
Well, to tell you the truth, I usually just let that stay at the default, so it's probably been linear. And I don't know, somebody asked the question, do they have a little bit more detail on what that would do, the difference between linear and nonlinear?
Well, after you've stretched or before you stretched it.
Oh, I do it after I stretch, typically.
And
But typically, that's the way I typically do it. I've not really tried it before the stretch. That's a good,
And
that's a good question.
what are your seeing conditions like? I guess you're imaging from a dark site and then from near home.
Yeah, this image of IC 1396 is from my driveway, Bortle 5 skies. And as far as the seeing conditions, 80%, 90% of the year, the jet stream is right overhead. So we have nice twinkling stars all the time. We never have still steady skies, rarely. And then up in the mountains, it's Bortle 1, Bortle 2 type skies.
From your dark site, what's your dark
Yes.
site?
It's right on the borderline between Bortle 1 and Bortle 2. And same seeing conditions. Some nights it could be really still, nice steady skies, but it all depends on where the jet stream is. And unfortunately, on the East Coast, the jet stream seems to be typically overhead.
Alex, do you have some questions? Alex?
Sorry, I was muted. I forgot. I mute myself in between. So, Brent, how much more do you have to say formally?
Well, that's fundamentally it.
Yeah, I've got some questions. What other programs have you had experience with in particular? I think it's Conrad wants to know if you've tried Star Tools.
Is Star Tools the one that will create the star trails, like for Polaris?
No, well, first off, it may do that. I don't know. I once used it about 4 or 5 years ago and couldn't figure it out, so I gave up on it. It may do that, but it is another comprehensive image processing program. From what I understand, it's supposed to stack and process and everything else.
No, I've not used Star Tools. I've used Star Stacks, and that's for creating star trails.
Okay.
No, my experience has been strictly Deep Sky Stacker for image processing, AstroPixel Processor. But then I've used IRIS, IRIS, for doing photometry to do exoplanet detection.
IRIS, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's got a big learning curve on it too. It's an old tool, but it works great.
Yeah.
For doing photometry.
Yeah, but it's not made for developing. It's not made for calibrating and stacking and all that other stuff. Hey,
it can do it, but not easily.
Excuse me. Beatrice, I have to ask this question because she's asked it, I think, 3 times. How do you use star color calibration properly? Have you had success with star color calibration?
The times that I've played with it, I didn't really see any difference in the image. So, I mean, as you can see, this is through a filter. So you're seeing a little bit of chromatic aberration, plus you're seeing, blue-green signal and red signal. This hasn't been kind of corrected for that. But I've done it a couple of different times, but I couldn't really see a difference. But it might be something I could play with, especially on one of these images that, as you can tell, have been shot through a filter.
So Beatrice, I think he's got the same problems you've got. It doesn't sound like he's got Brett's had a lot of experience with it. I have a generic question. This is an image processing program. It's not made to gather data. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct.
Okay. You say you use it in place of Deep Sky Stacker and then to do a little bit of the stacking, and then you move it into Photoshop. Is that its intent? When the guy or the team, or the women who wrote this particular program, did they expect it to be a product that would take you from the raw data all the way through to a finished image?
Yes. I think the intent of APP, especially if you look at the tools on the right side of the screen with all the control that you have with the stretching, going through some of the stretching algorithms and contrast and saturation are to produce a final image.
Now, Beatrice mentioned that she uses a different program to do that final stuff. You mentioned you do Photoshop. Why? Why are you guys using a different program instead of the program that you're telling us about tonight?
Comfort level with Photoshop. Just because I've been using it for so long outside of Deep Sky Stacker. So Deep Sky Stacker doesn't have really any post-processing tools.
Right.
So I've got a good history of being able to tweak stretch data outside of Photoshop. You're using Photoshop to pull the data out, and that's what I'm comfortable with. And as and like I said, I'll save one of each, a non-stretched image and then a stretched image, and I'll pull them both into Photoshop and see which one I can get the best result from.
I remember, and many of us remember, when PixInsight first came out, we were all experienced with using Deep Sky Stacker or Images Plus or Maxim or whatever it was, and then finishing them up in Photoshop. Even though we had PixInsight that nominally could do everything, we all just hung in there because, Photoshop can still do this better and it can still do that better. When in fact, what we meant was we don't know how to use PixInsight to do those things that we're very comfortable using in Photoshop. It sounds like it's something akin to that with your use of APP.
Yeah, that's correct. For example, I'll bring this into Photoshop and I'll do some star reduction, kind of minimize the stars a little bit, either using Photoshop directly or using Noel Carboni Photoshop actions. There's just some nice little ways of doing that in Photoshop that I don't think that you can do inside of APP, as far as shrinking the star size or things like that. You might be able to, but I've just never gone there, just because once I get to here, I go straight to Photoshop.
Okay, we're checking out the last of the questions over there. If you've got it, I think we've gotten just about everybody at one point or another, and we've all had a lesson in making red question marks, which was new to me. If there's anybody else that's got anything, please get it in right now, because we're starting to wrap up. Brent, how do we get a hold of you if we want to ask you any further questions about this stuff? Do you have a website that you show your stuff on or anything like that?
Not right now, just Facebook. You can friend me on Facebook,
Okay.
Brent Maynard. Also, just send me an email message at brent.maynard@marshall.edu.
Okay, that's cool. And it looks like we are out of questions. We want to thank you. There's a lot of people got a lot out of your presentation tonight, and we really appreciate that. Next week, Molly's going to tell us a little bit about how she's been organizing how she's been organizing all of the YouTube programs that we've had over the last 6 years, so we can find things more easily. Andy Astro will be coming to tell us about how to create some dynamic images. Hope you're all back next week. Hope if you enjoyed the show that you're going to click the old button that says you're subscribing. And I think we're ready to go. Molly, take us out.
Will do. Have a good night, all.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Night.